Good morning. Welcome to yet another beautiful episode of The Morning Momentum this Thursday morning. My name is Alfonsoh, and let's take a look at the top stories making the headlines on the newspapers. As usual, this is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. Let's take a look at the Standard newspaper. The top story: headliners fears over Ruto-Raila deal in making. Leaders from the two political divides are jittery over a possible deal between the president and the opposition leader that might render them orphans. That story is scaled up for you on page 6 of the Standard newspaper. Also, national news: Uhuru's son wins first court gun battle with DCI. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. Also, teachers and civil servants shock over pay cuts. That is under national news on page 7. And the question of the day: did they have to die? Families honor protest victims. More of that story is on page 10, 11, and 12 of the Standard newspaper. Also on page 3, harder without hands, top academic. From the battles of Baragoi, Samburu, John Lokuta, a voice determination, has seen him scale heights in academia to become a lecturer. Let's delve into the Standard and see what stories are inside here today. Now, on page 2, tears as woman in the battle for Nyachai billions is put to task. Margaret Chwea claims she married the powerful cabinet minister and had 3 children. Nyachai family says she has married 4 men, 2 in the US, but was never part of them. You can get to read that story on page 2 of the Standard newspaper. Moving on swiftly to page 3, down by the hardship in Baragoi, boy without hands scaling education heights. Unlike his childhood peers in Samburu, he couldn't look after cattle because he has no hands. Last week, a boy graduated with a master's degree after winning a scholarship and university job. That's an amazing story. You have to catch up with it on page 3 of the Standard newspaper. On page 4, court reinstates Uhuru's son gun license until case is determined. Jomo says he fears that his safety is in jeopardy now that the public knows he has no weapon. Lawyer argues that there has been no complaints over the use of Jomo's guns. You can read that story on page 4. Also on page 4, DPP barred from giving evidence against Waititu. The prosecution has suffered a blow in bid to nail former Kiambu Governor Ferdinand Waititu in a 588 million Kenya shillings corruption case after the court rejected admission of crucial evidence. On page 5, village elders to earn 7,000 in new bill. MP proposes allowances for senior citizens attending village barazas. Colleagues say that the elders have been useful since independence. More of that story on page 5. On page 6, jitters in Azimio. Kenya Kwanza over plans for Ruto Raila talks. Ruto allies fear that trust will bring confusion to Kenya Kwanza's political arrangement. Azimio leaders want dialogue to revolve around public welfare and not handshake. You can get to read more of that story on page 6 of the Standard newspaper. On page 7, fresh salary pain for new civil servants as new NSSF rates effected. New pension rates effected in July salaries for civil servants, and civil servant union leader says they have called for a crisis meeting. That story is on page 7 of the Standard newspaper. On page 8, call for African curriculum, more ICT use as summit ends. Experts unanimous on the need to harmonize curricula for easy exchange of human resources. PS Kipsang notes ICT infrastructure and developing capacity of managers and teachers needed. More insights on that story on page 8 of the Standard newspaper. On matters technology, UNESCO lauds Kenya for leading content in coding education. The UN has recognized Kenya as the first country in Africa to approve content for teaching computer programming lessons in primary and secondary schools. More of that story on page 8. Let's take a look at page 10. Somber mood as Azimio leaders honor supporters killed in demos. Opposition leaders visit the injured in hospital and make a stop at city mortuary. Azimio to hold service in honor of victims tomorrow and launch a funds drive. You can get to read that story on page 10 of the Standard newspaper. On page 12, still under national news, did they have to die? Kin mourn their loved ones killed in protests. Some victims of the demos were sole breadwinners for their families. Others were too young and offered hope of a better future to their relatives. You can get to read that story on page 12 of the Standard newspaper. On page 13, victims of police brutality recall scary encounters during demos. Most of them engaged the officers with pleading voices to stop the beatings. Others pleaded with the menacing officers to stop hurting their children. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 13 of the Standard newspaper. Let's take a look at some expert opinion. And beyond words, the opposition experiment has failed. Let's now do away with it. An article by Elias. Protesters against the cost of living and litany of other political grievances in Kenya elicit mixed feelings in a deeper reflections on what democracy is all about. You can get to read that story on page 14. On page 15, there is a question of should village elders rather be paid monthly allowances. Now, Fabian Muli, Kangundo MP, says yes, swiftly implement this proposal. On the other end, Philip Kajimba, a businessman in Migori, says no, it's part of political game plan. Those sentiments are there on page 15. You can get to read them in depth and have a clear understanding of their sentiments on page 15. On page 16, the West's new gospel echoes colonial religious conversations. There is one aspect of the struggle for independence that I find rather puzzling. How did the generation that witnessed the end of the European colonial project in Kenya in the 1960s, so infamous for the gun in one hand and Bible in the other? You can get to read that story on page 16 of the Standard newspaper. On the Reader's Corner, after all these deaths in demos, is it in order to say that police officers acted with restrained use of force? You can get to read that story on page 17. Let's take a look at some business news on the Standard newspaper. Minority shareholders of Kenya Power to get slots in the board. Treasury proposes changes in planned restructuring to be completed next year. Company is projected to make a 5.5 billion loss in the year ended June 2023. You can get to read that story on page 18 under business news on today's Standard newspaper. Let's move on to some shipping and logistics. Mombasa port cargo volumes up as Dar rivalry grows fierce. Now, KPA is now targeting landlocked countries, that is Rwanda, Burundi, and DR Congo. You can also get to read that story on shipping and logistics. That is an article very insightful to those who import goods to the country. Let's now shift gears and go to some international news. On page 24, evacuations as Mediterranean wildfires kill 40 in 3 states. The heaviest death toll so far is in Algeria. Algeria's Bejaia is the worst hit area, according for 23 of the 34 deaths. More of that story is on page 24. On page 25, Speculation over China minister's removal. No reason was given for Qin's removal. His predecessor, Wang Yi, has been reappointed to the post. You can get to read that story on page 25. An article on the real estate is also here on page 27, all the way to page 30. And let's take a look at this story. Kajiado's population pressure prompts plan rethink. The county targets challenges caused by unplanned developments, including traffic menace, roadside trading, and scattered rural settlements. More of that story on page 30 and page 31 of the Standard newspaper. Let's shift gears and take a look at sports news on the Standard now. New champions rise in Nyanza as bigwigs put to the sword. New champions were crowned in football, netball, volleyball boys, and basketball 3x3. Only Nyakach girls volleyball and St. Mary Siala rugby defended their titles. You can get to read that story on page 37. Let's take a look at page 38. Will Kenya dance to the top once again in Budapest? It remains to be seen if the squad will replace 2015 show in Beijing, which topped the world. Kenya has since won 161 medals since inception of the World Championships in 1983 in Helsinki. You can get to read that story on page 38. On page 39, preview. Kipruto and Chepngetich face a strong field in Chicago. Organizers of the Bank of America Chicago Marathon have announced the full elite field for the World Athletics Elite Platinum Label Road race on October 8th. You can get to read that story on page 39. On the cover page, the Nigeria star balancing cancer research and football. Super Falcons defender Alozi talks about her dual passions of medicine and football. The Super Falcons defender finds time to pursue both her passions. That's an amazing story. Michelle Alozi, this is a sentiment by the Falcons defender. Hopefully in a few years, they can actually call me Dr. Alozi. But now I just need to be Michelle. You can read that story on the cover page of the Standard newspaper. Also on Women World Cup, Japan down Costa Rica to put one foot in last 16. Japan are on the verge of qualifying for the FIFA Women's World Cup around 16 after a routine win over Costa Rica. You can get to read that story on the cover page of the Standard newspaper. Let's take a short break and then we come back with the top stories on the Daily Nation. You can keep interacting with us at our social media platforms, Younib_TV on Instagram, Younib Media TV on Facebook and on YouTube. You can also send in your sentiments via our SMS line 0719144144, and we'll get to sample them on the other end of this broadcast. See you in a few. Welcome back to the morning momentum. You are still rolling with your host, Alfonsoh. Now, let's take a look at the top stories on the Daily Nation. The elephant in the room, the big shift. Top politicians closing ranks, but ODM chief insists on presence of a mediator. President Ruto, his predecessor, Kenyatta, and Azimio chief Odinga are seemingly dropping their earlier hardline positions, with the latter two now acknowledging the Ruto presidency and the former inviting the opposition chief for talks on the current protests that have also moved from the row over the 2022 polls to the high cost of living. We will take a look at that on page 4 and page 5 of the Daily Nation. Also, KRA plans to backdate new taxes. Shock awaits employment persons across the country. Should the Court of Appeal lift the conversatory orders barring implementation of the Finance Act 2023? That story is beefed up for you on page 8. As teachers get a cut in July payslips. Teachers yesterday received reduced July salaries instead of an expected pay rise as their employer, the TSC, made new deductions. That story is beefed up for you on page 8. After vigils for victims of protests, Azimio plans prayers to mourn the dead. DAPK party leader Eugene Wamalwa joins women leaders in lighting candles and laying flowers in honor of opposition protesters who lost their lives in recent anti-government demos. That story is beefed up for you on page 6. On Matters Sports, American legend tips Omanyala to shine. He's on cusp of making history, says Johnson. That story is beefed up for you on page 32. And on to NHIF haste. 2 hospitals handed 5-year suspension. National Health Insurance Fund boss tells MPs their investigations found Amal and Beirut hospitals, both based in Nairobi's Isli, guilty of fraud. More of that story on page 12 of the Daily Nation. Let's take a look at the stories inside the Daily Nation. Inside data privacy row between rights lobby, Google Kenya. Now, petitioners claim firm collects, processes, and stores users' personal data without their knowledge and consent. Multinational tech firm has denied breaching Kenya's data protection laws. That story is beefed up for you on page 2 of the Daily Nation. Let's shift and look at page 3. Students' death during riot puts police under spotlight. County police says there is a likelihood student fell and hit a hard surface as he ran. Victim's body is said to have had visible signs of injury on the head and other parts. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Let's move to page 4. Ruto Raila inch towards dialogue amid sustained pressure. A stalemate. Signs of trust emerged on Tuesday when the president offered to meet Raila hours after the ODM boss had said he had no problem talking to the head of state. More of that story on page 4 of the Standard newspaper. Let's shift gears to page 6. Police brutality. Protests aftermath. Opposition to hold national prayers in honor of the dead. Thousands of opposition supporters across the country lit candles in honor of protest victims. You can get to read that story on page 6 of the Daily Nation. On page 7, PS, stop breaking law during protests. Chief's home in Bondo torched during demos. You can get to read that story on page 7. Dr. Omolo says lawbreakers during demos will be dealt with firmly. On page 8, deductions. Teachers received reduced July pay instead of an increase. Teachers are for the first time contributing to National Social Security Fund, NSSF. A salary increment promised by the president in June was not effected in the July salaries. More of that story on page 8. On page 10, legislation bid to teach sex education in primary school triggers row. It's up to parents to impart values on children, some MPs insist. Also on other news, agency suspends sugar milling in Western and Nyanza. More of those stories on page 10. On page 12, the NHIF fraud. 2 hospitals suspended for 5 years. Other facilities implicated in the fraud scheme are still under investigation, with reports expected in 90 days. Health Insurers Acting CEO says facilities were found guilty of engaging in fraud. More of that story on page 12. Now, let's take a look at some expert opinion why discourse on aging and disability is necessary. The global population is getting older courtesy of improved life expectancy and declining fertility rates. While this is more evident in the global north, similar trends are reported in developing nations like Kenya. You can get to read that story on page 14. Also, sexuality education vital. Parenting calls for education, for dedication and sacrifice, this being a long-lasting engagement. Sadly, many parents are increasingly abandoning their children, exposing them to harrowing experiences. You can get more of that story on page 15. Also, who will stand up for good Africa? Mass expulsions of Africans from African countries other than theirs are larger than in Western and Asian countries. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 15 of the Daily Nation. Let's take a look at some county news. Sonko faces fresh probe over missing billions. Sakaja says centralized impress system was prone to abuse. You can get to read that story on page 17. Audit reports show millions were withdrawn without supporting documentation. Let's take a look at page 18. Top staff face long commutes on housing crisis in counties. Development has been blamed on failure to build official residences for senior staff. In Vihiga County, set protests for Sundays, trade lobby pleads with opposition. More of that story on page 18. On matters property, the evolution of Kenya's retail real estate industry. Tenants who previously would not have been considered for a convenience retail centers, such as fashion designers, opticians, pharmacists, and outlets, such as coffee shops and gyms, are moving towards convenience retail. You can read more of that story on page 20 and page 21 of the Daily Nation. Now let's take a look at some international news right here. North Korea gives Russians a rousing welcome. Also in Somalia, Somalia uses football to battle Al-Shabaab. Clubs in central Somalia have become big employers. Now, also Thanksgiving in Indonesia, the fruits of our labor. Men with fruits and vegetables during a Thanksgiving ceremony called Sedak Bumi in West Java, Indonesia, on July 23rd. More of those stories are briefed up for you on page 23. On business news, Savannah Cement creditors asked to file claims. Creditors are now free to file claims against Savannah Cement, currently under administration over unpaid debt by Absa Bank and KCB Bank. On matters manufacturing, firms raise goods prices by 9.2% on higher taxes. Galloping cost of commodities has choked demand. High input charges pile pressure on manufacturers grappling with steep trade fees. You can get to read that story on page 24. Let's take a look at sports news on the Daily Nation today. And relay team plans shift into top gear. Stars Mora Kinyamal spearhead Kenyans charge in German meet. Also, World Athletic Championships, Kenya ranked 16th globally. Let's take a look at football. All facilities for 2027 AFCON bid to be ready by 2025, says CS Ababu Namwamba. That story is on page 33. Is Africa on verge of history in the men's 100 meters? At Monaco, Omanyala and Tebogo provided further evidence. That's a sentiment by Barnaba Korir. Now, facilities for AFCON bid will be ready by 2025, says CS Ababu Namwamba. CAF, Tanzanian, Ugandan, and FKF officials attend meeting at MISC in Kasarani. On Women's World Cup, contenders Spain, Japan first teams to roll into last 16. More of that story on page 33. On page 34, big countdown. 20 Kenyan federations chase Paris tickets. Olympic Games qualification guided by several factors, including the universality principle, which allows select federations to get some allocation quotas. Currently, the Kenyan boxing team is in Yaoundé for the African Boxing Championships and will have another shot for Paris tickets at September's Olympic qualifiers in Dakar. You can read that story on page 34 and page 35 of today's Daily Nation. Let's take a look at the cover page. It's all about deductions. Pay shocker awaits workers as KRA readies for new taxes. Housing tax and higher rates for new income tax bans set to eat into employees' take home. Court decide on lifting conservatory orders against Finance Act tomorrow. More of that story on the cover page. Also, Gachagua hints at impending changes in the country's diplomatic corps. 70% of their job will be to pursue the commercial interests of our country. That's a sentiment by the Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua. Also, countdown to Paris. Kenya's hunt for tickets to the 2024 Olympic Games continues with 20 federations on pathway as Paris marks 365 days to Games. Yeah, so with that story, we come to an end of today's morning momentum. Many thanks to all those who made this broadcast a success. John Tay behind the camera and Anifa Kavira on the controls, Elias Muchina on the directing end. See you tomorrow, same time, same place, and do have a beautiful day ahead of you.